These are great times. Man has mounted science and has now run away with it. Before many centuries more, science may have the existence of mankind in its power, and the human race commits suicide by blowing up the world. Henry Adams, Londoner, 1862, in response to the Battle of the Ironclads.
Many months of sacrifice and self-discipline lie ahead, months in which both our patience and our will be tested, months in which many threats and denunciations will keep us aware of our dangers. But the greatest danger of all would be to do nothing.
But what if doing nothing was the only way to keep the human race from blowing up the world?
It was October 27, 1962, and Soviet Navy Captain Vasily Arkhipov was faced with the biggest decision of his life. His first option was to agree to set off a nuclear-tipped torpedo with more destructive power than the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. His second, to compromise his secret mission and return to the Soviet Union in defeat. In simpler words, intensify the conflict or compromise his mission.
Maybe the war has already started up there, while we are doing somersaults here. We're going to blast them now. We will die, but we will sink them all. We will not disgrace our Navy. Second Captain Valentin Savitsky.
Vasily Arkhipov had a choice. What should he do?
Ever since the Bay of Pigs invasion in May 1961, the relations between the Soviet Union and Cuba had been growing stronger, with Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet premier, promising to protect the smaller country from any more American invasions. John Kennedy, strongly opposed to communism, saw this bond between the two countries as a major threat.
After getting wind of mysterious activity in Cuba, the U.S. sent out a U-2 reconnaissance plane on October 14, 1962. It returned from Cuba, carrying disturbing photographs of 3 separate military bases being built on Cuban soil. 2 of these bases held nuclear missiles that could hit Washington, D.C. if fired. At this point, however, they were still inoperable. 2 days later, President Kennedy was informed of the situation and the Cuban Missile Crisis began.
Both the United States and the Soviet Union were on the brink of the worst conflict the world had ever faced. Both President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev were under severe pressure to make the right decisions and avoid total nuclear war. However, it was not solely in their hands that the balance rested. One other man, faced with one seemingly simple choice, would directly affect the entire outcome with his decision.
Before the United States had even sent their spy plane, a flotilla of 4 Soviet submarines had been deployed from Saida Harbor in the Kola Peninsula. Their destination was Port Mariel in Cuba. Their mission, to bring supplies for the installation of a new military base there. Each submarine was equipped with 21 regular torpedoes and 1 nuclear-tipped torpedo.
Back in the United States, the threat of more offensive weapons being shipped to Cuba loomed over President Kennedy. On October 21st, Kennedy and his advisors decided on a course of action, a naval blockade in international waters which would stop and search any ships bound for Cuba. Those carrying offensive weapons or equipment that could be used to operate such weapons would be turned back, while those with normal cargo would be permitted to continue. Force would be used only when necessary. To Khrushchev, it was nothing more than piracy. However, the United States gained the unanimous approval of the Organization of American States to set up the blockade, and on October 23rd, Kennedy signed Proclamation 3504 into action.
By this point, the 4 Soviet submarines had sailed into the Sargasso Sea to the east of Cuba. But knowledge of their deployment from Russia had already reached the United States, and it wasn't long before their positions were discovered.
On October 27th, submarine B-59, carrying Second Captain Vasily Arkhipov on board, was completely hemmed in by the American destroyers that had been dogging it for the past week. Caught below the surface of the water, the Soviets were now in a desperate situation.
It wasn't just their discovery by the Americans that made the situation desperate. The submarine had been built to operate in Arctic conditions, and, in the tropical waters off of Cuba, the temperature inside the sub soared between 80 and 90 degrees Fahrenheit. The air was stuffy, humid, and they were beginning to run out of oxygen. Additionally, the crew, suffering from heat stroke and rashes, received only 1 glass of water per day and a reduced food supply.
But this wasn't all. The Americans began dropping practice depth charges into the water next to the submarine. These were small, harmless torpedoes approved only recently by John F. Kennedy as a signal for submarines to surface. The Soviet government had been notified of this procedure, but the submarines had not. They had been out of contact with Moscow for some time now.
The Americans surrounded us and started to tighten the circle, practicing attacks and dropping depth charges. They exploded right next to the hull. It felt like you were sitting in a metal barrel, which somebody is constantly blasting with a sledgehammer. The situation was quite unusual, if not to say shocking, for the crew. Veda Morlock, an intelligence officer on B-59.
This went on for about 4 or 5 hours. The submarine's solar batteries were dangerously low, and they would need to surface in order to recharge. The situation seemed hopeless. Finally, Captain Valentian Savitsky, the submarine commander, lost control. He was underwater, caught in the midst of explosions, and without any way to contact his superiors. From his perspective, the Americans were attacking his sub, and World War III might well have already broken out.
Savitsky ordered the submarine's nuclear torpedo to be prepared for launching. To set it off, however, he needed the agreement of the 2 other top officials on board. Deputy Political Officer Ivan Semenovich Maslenikov gave his approval. It was then up to Second Captain Vasily Arkhipov to finalize the decision.
This was more than just a decision to set off a torpedo. This could mean total nuclear war. It was a time of intense conflict on multiple levels. Vasily could either vote yes or no regarding the torpedo. His decision would affect the officers' conflict over either setting off the torpedo or compromising the mission, which would mean returning to Russia in disgrace. On the other hand, how could they set off a torpedo that could easily start World War III? All the ensuing possibilities rested on Vasily's decision, and if he made the wrong choice...
But Vasily Arkhipov kept his head. He knew that it was madness to fire the nuclear torpedo, his wife Olga said later, and so he voted no. Instead, he said that the submarine should come to the surface and surrender.
Because Vasily's consent was needed to fire the torpedo, Savitsky and Maslenikov had to agree to leave it unlaunched. They finally gave in and decided to surface.
It was 9:00 p.m. on October 27th when they emerged and found themselves surrounded by American destroyers. For the next 2 days, they were dogged by their pursuers. The Americans flew overhead with searchlights, pointed guns at the sub, and attempted to make the Soviets communicate, but they would not reply. Finally, on October 30th, with its batteries recharged, B-59 dove and escaped. The sub returned to the Soviet Union, where its crew faced disgrace for failing to complete their mission. One Russian admiral even said, "It would have been better if you had gone down with your ship."
On October 28th, one day after the submarine surfaced, the Cuban Missile Crisis came to an end. Kennedy agreed not to invade Cuba, while Khrushchev conceded to take down the missiles there. Secretly, Kennedy also promised to dismantle American missiles set up in Turkey within 6 months. This compromise averted disaster, and things slowly began to return to normal.
For 21st century Americans, Vasily Arkhipov's role in the crisis might seem insignificant. Does it really matter that he kept the torpedo from being fired? Perhaps if the torpedo actually had been launched, nothing would have come of it. But perhaps not, and Vasily couldn't afford to take that chance.
40 years passed before Vasily's actions began to be publicized. In 2002, a conference was held in Havana for the 40th anniversary of the crisis. During this event, intelligence officer Vadim Orlov revealed details of B-59's experience, including Vasily's role. People finally realized just how important it was for Vasily to compromise his mission and thus prevent all-out war. His decision gave Kennedy and Khrushchev the time to work out their own compromise. If Vasily had instead agreed to launch the torpedo, the United States would most likely have responded by attacking the Soviet Union, which in turn would have fired its Cuban missiles on the U.S. The ensuing war would have been devastating, costing millions of lives.
In Cuba, in honor of the 40th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis, people gathered. They said that the person who prevented a nuclear war was the Russian submariner Vasily Arkhipov. I was proud, and I am proud of my husband always, Olga Arkhipova. Saving the world doesn't always include daring deeds that are heralded to the skies. Sometimes the only way to save the world is to do nothing. Nothing at all.